There was a version of you that felt everything, that trusted quickly, that gave without calculating the cost, that believed people meant what they said and stayed the way they promised. That version of you is gone, and somewhere beneath everything you have become, you already know it is never coming back. Most men do not announce this change. They do not hold a funeral for the version of themselves that used to feel more. It simply happens over time, quietly, in the accumulated weight of moments where the world showed them something they could not unfeel. And the man standing on the other side of that education is a different creature entirely. Not angrier, not louder. Something quieter and far more difficult to reach. This is where most people make the wrong assumption. They see emotional distance in a man and call it damage. They see detachment and call it coldness. They see someone who no longer reacts and assume something broke inside him. What they are actually looking at is the end result of a process that most men never fully understand while they are inside it. A process that Machiavelli observed in every court, every political chamber, every room where power moved between people. He understood that the most dangerous men were not the loudest ones. They were the ones who had learned to observe without revealing that they were observing. The ones who had been through enough to stop performing emotion for rooms that did not deserve the performance. The ones who had been educated by experience into something that comfort could never have produced. But the process that creates that man is not clean. It is not fast. And it does not begin with strength. It begins with the opposite. There was a moment, and you remember it even if you have never named it, where something stopped working the way it used to, where a familiar feeling stopped arriving on schedule, where trust, which once extended automatically, suddenly required more before it moved. You noticed it. You were not sure what to call it. You told yourself it was just a phase, that you were tired, that the right situation would open you back up again. But the right situation arrived, and the opening did not happen. And slowly you began to understand that what felt like a temporary closing was actually something more permanent being constructed, not by you consciously, by the accumulated weight of what you had lived through. Men do not choose coldness. That is the part nobody explains clearly enough. Coldness is not a personality decision. It is a structural response to repeated contact with specific realities about human nature. The first time someone betrays you, it feels like an anomaly. Something specific to that person, that situation, that particular failure of character. You process it and move forward with the belief that the exception has been identified and the general rule still holds. Then it happens again, with a different person in a different context producing the identical outcome. And then again, not identically but recognizably. And somewhere in the repetition, the brain stops classifying each instance as an individual exception and starts recognizing the pattern beneath all of them. That moment of pattern recognition is where the transformation actually begins, not in the betrayal itself, in what the betrayal revealed about the predictable distance between how people present themselves and how they actually behave when something real is at stake. Machiavelli wrote that men deceive themselves about this distance more than about anything else. They see people as they wish them to be, rather than as repeated behavior has demonstrated them to be. And that gap between the wished version and the actual version is where most men spend enormous amounts of energy that produces nothing except disappointment on a reliable schedule. The man who closes that gap does not become cruel. He becomes accurate. An accurate perception, when it replaces hopeful projection, changes everything about how a man moves through the world. Watch what happens to behavior after the pattern is recognized. The man who once led with openness begins to lead with observation. The man who once gave trust freely begins to allow behavior to accumulate before trust is extended. The man who once needed people to understand him stops requiring their understanding as a condition for his own internal stability. He begins to contain himself differently, not performing in vulnerability, actually becoming harder to reach in the specific places where he was once easiest to manipulate. And manipulation always works through the same entry points: the need for approval, the fear of losing connection, the discomfort of being misunderstood, the requirement that certain people maintain a certain perception of you before you can feel settled. These are not character flaws. They are attachment points. And anyone who knows where your attachment points are knows how to move you. Machiavelli understood this with clinical precision. He observed that the man who needs the approval of the room can be controlled by whoever controls the room's approval. The man who fears losing a specific person can be managed through the strategic withdrawal of that person's presence. The man who cannot tolerate being perceived negatively will reshape his behavior in any direction required to correct that perception. All of these men are being operated by external inputs they did not consciously choose to depend on. The transformation you underwent, the one that people around you misread as damage, removed those attachment points one by one. Not gently. That is not how they are removed. They are removed through the specific experience of having them exploited until depending on them becomes obviously more dangerous than releasing them. You felt something die. That is the only accurate way to describe it. Not a dramatic death. A quiet one. The slow extinguishing of the version of you that required specific things from specific people in order to remain functional. And in the space left behind by what died, something else began to take shape. The painful part was not the betrayal. The painful part was what betrayal revealed. That some of the connections you had assigned enormous value to were held together primarily by your own willingness to overlook what they actually were. That some of the loyalty you believed surrounded you was conditional on you remaining in a position that was useful to the people offering it. That some of the warmth directed at you was not warmth at all, but strategy wearing warmth's face. This is not a dark fantasy about paranoia. This is an accurate observation about how social dynamics function when examined without the interference of wishful thinking. Machiavelli was not paranoid. He was observant. And observation without sentimentality reveals that human social behavior is governed less by the values people profess and more by the interests people protect. The man who understands this is not destroyed by it. He is calibrated by it. He stops making expensive emotional investments based on what people say and starts making measured ones based on what people consistently do. This shift alone separates him from the majority of men who will spend their entire lives confused about why people they trusted keep disappointing them in patterns they cannot explain. The transformation did not begin when they hurt you. It began when you started paying attention to what the hurt was showing you, and what it showed you cannot be given back. It lives in your perception now, functioning automatically, beneath conversation, beneath social performance. Reading rooms and people and dynamics in real time with a fluency that only comes from having paid for it through direct experience. Now consider what this actually produces in a man walking through daily life. He no longer requires the validation of the room to feel stable inside it. He can sit in disapproval without reorganizing himself to correct it. He can be misunderstood without launching an explanation designed to recover the other person's perception of him. He can watch people test his boundaries and remain still because he is no longer afraid of the consequence of allowing the test to fail. He has become expensive to manipulate. Not impossible, but expensive enough that most people will not bother. Most manipulation operates on the assumption of emotional availability, that the target needs something enough to be moved by its withdrawal. The man who has burned through enough illusions to reduce his emotional dependencies has also reduced the surface area through which he can be reached. Not completely, but significantly. And significantly is enough to change every dynamic he walks into. People sense this before they can articulate it. They do not know what they are responding to. They simply notice that the usual mechanisms do not produce the usual results with this particular man. That approval and disapproval seem to register differently in him than in most people. That he is not chasing anything visible. That there is a self-containment in him that does not feel like performance, but like something genuinely structural. And people respond to self-containment with something close to respect, even when they cannot explain why. Machiavelli wrote that men respect what they fear losing more than what they are certain to keep. The man who appears to need nothing activates something in the people around him that the man who needs everything never will. Not because withholding is a strategy, because genuine self-sufficiency reads differently than any performance of it. And genuine self-sufficiency only comes from having wanted things badly, having lost them or been denied them, and having discovered that the loss did not actually end anything fundamental. That discovery changes the biochemistry of desire. You stop needing things at the same intensity, not because you stopped wanting. Because you survived the absence and found something on the other side of it that the wanting had been obscuring. Yourself, without their input, without their validation, without the constant referencing of external reactions to determine whether you are on solid ground. The strange thing was not becoming cold. The strange thing was realizing that what other people called cold was simply the presence of self-possession in a man who had previously been mostly possessed by the needs and opinions of others. Becoming unstoppable was never about becoming harder to injure. It was about removing the dependency structures that required you to stay in positions that injured you. The man who does not need your approval cannot be held hostage by its withdrawal. The man who is not afraid of losing you cannot be controlled through the threat of your absence. The man who has already sat alone and found that solitude was survivable has removed the primary mechanism most people use to manage the behavior of others. Strong men are not born cold. Life removes their illusions slowly, specifically, and without asking their permission. And the man left standing after that process has been completed is not who he was before. He is quieter. He requires less. He reveals almost nothing about where he can be reached. He watches more than he speaks and understands more than he watches. And the people who tried to make him smaller never fully understand that the version of him they could manage no longer exists. They kept the boy they knew. What emerged from that education is something they do not have the context to recognize, and it moves through the world in ways they will never be able to predict or prepare for, because it no longer needs anything they have.